Senior national correspondent Terry Moran, who was there at that Pennsylvania rally. And Terry, let's talk about the goal of this rally. Trump is in a heavily Republican area of a part of that state. He's outside of Pittsburgh. He's in a steel town. He's got people with hard hats sitting there behind him. Talk to me about this appeal that Trump is trying to make to these rural voters, trying to run up the margins there.
There's no question. This is the swing state of Pennsylvania. This is Trump heartland, this part of Pennsylvania. And as for those workers, right, the whole essence of Trump's Make America Great Again really economically rests on his notion that America should make things again. Manufacturing, this part of America, obviously with the steel mills, which left 40 years ago. They're going to bring that back entirely. But he thinks that the offshoring of American manufacturing, which was accomplished, essentially by investors over the course of many decades, was a mistake. That resonates here, right? Fracking is a big, big industry now here. It is a boom industry, of course, and that's a point of difference that he can underline for these workers as well. He has and he will. He believes that Make America Great Again means making America back to work in those industrial era industries that he believes should be onshore, taken back, especially after the pandemic. It's a key part of his appeal here.
This election, Terry, in many ways, is going to be fought on a number of different fronts, but one of them is this feeling about the economy. Because if you look at the numbers of the economy, inflation is cooling, joblessness numbers are relatively low, and the job numbers appear strong. But there is a feeling in some parts of the country that those numbers that they see, that the stock market, for example, doesn't necessarily affect them. And in fact, there's numbers that back that up. In Cambria County, where Donald Trump is speaking right now, since 2019, when the New York Times found it, I thought this was interesting, that they have actually 6% fewer jobs from 2019 to 2023. So while you hear about these job gains and the Biden administration, and they are very much real, they don't hit every single county in this country equally. Do you think that that works in Donald Trump's favor, some of these counties feeling left behind?
No question. His appeal, that's why he comes to places like Johnstown, which isn't often visited by presidential candidates in previous elections, is because this is where America got left behind. Where people, when they offshored the steel industry and other manufacturing industries, and even during the Biden administration, right, those inflation numbers, those jobs numbers, it's not even across the country. In a place like this, they have lost jobs. And for a lot of families in the middle and lower middle working class families, that inflation was just killing. I remember the inflation much higher from the 1970s. Living with inflation in your family is a demoralizing experience, a grinding down of the spirit of possibility. And that here, you can sense that as well. We talk to people that they can't afford to live. Somebody said, look, you used to be able to have a decent living on $40,000 a year. I can't even, get by here. And that is a clarion call that Trump is making to people, that he can turn that around. Now, can he? I don't know, but they certainly blame the current administration. That's where those unfavorable numbers on the Biden presidency are really coming from.
And Terry, one more thing, if you don't mind. I want to drill down on this idea of Pennsylvania and some of these Republican-heavy counties, because the Trump strategy is to run up the vote totals in places like where he is now in Johnstown, which, can be a swingish city, but it's in a county that's heavily Republican, and it's surrounded by counties that are heavily Republican. Kamala Harris is trying to penetrate that. Her campaign is trying to appeal to rural Democrats to try to offset any gains Trump would make in those rural Republican-heavy counties. Do you see that as being effective from what you've seen in the campaign trail? Could Tim Walz, for instance, who's got rural roots himself, penetrate in some of those rural counties in a place like Pennsylvania, or is it just too strong of a Trump country?
No, there's no question about it. I think there's no question that Tim Walz is going to come to counties like this across the country, certainly in all those swing states. And there's a reason, because there are votes there. You might not be able to win the county, but just walking away from Democrats who are going to stay home. Same with Trump in the cities. The coalitions are not as fixed as it seems, right? There are indications that some Hispanic voters have come to Trump, some black voters have come to Trump, young black men in particular, young people, young men in particular. And in the other direction, there are indications that Democrats can play. They can play in rural counties, can play in counties that they've given up on. It mixes up the board a little bit in a very healthy way, right? You have to expand your message. We're seeing Trump doing it, and we're seeing the Harris-Walz campaign doing it as well.
Terry, forgive me, we have a little bit of breaking news that I just want to get in here, which is that before he took that stage behind you, former President Trump did an interview with Fox News, and he gave his clearest answer yet on how he would vote on his home state's ballot measure that would enshrine abortion rights into that state constitution and essentially repeal a current Florida state law that bans abortions after 6 weeks, which is before most women know that they are pregnant. Here is what Trump said about that, and it's kind of illustrative as to his thoughts on the abortion issue in general. And remember, Trump has bragged about appointing those 3 Supreme Court justices that were instrumental in overturning Roe. He said about how he would vote, quote, he said first he would be voting no, and then he said, I think 6 weeks, which is the state law in Florida, you need more time than 6 weeks. I've disagreed with that from the early primaries. When I heard about it, I disagree with it. At the same time, again, I'm quoting from Trump here, the Democrats are radical, so I'll be voting no for that reason. So he seems to try to kind of split the issue here and say that he doesn't agree with the 6-week ban, but he's also going to vote no on the ballot measure that would overturn the 6-week ban. How is this going to play, in your view, with suburban women voters, particularly there in Pennsylvania, that Trump has got to make inroads with if he wants to be successful?
Well, there's no question, Jay, the reason he is saying these things, and also the fact that he now wants the government to pay for IVF treatments, which Catholics, Southern Baptists, a lot of pro-life, anti-abortion rights people believe is the equivalent of abortion, because there are many embryos that get discarded. And if you believe that life begins at conception, that is an immoral thing to do. Trump wants no part of that because he sees the mainstream. What's happening after the striking down of Roe versus Wade is that both parties realize that their extremes aren't where the country is. The country supported Roe versus Wade. Polls show for decades that they supported it by 2-to-1 measures. And the politicians are following. They're groping for the center, trying to get to the center, because they know being outside that center, as the past several special elections in 2022 demonstrated, that this is a dangerous place to be, because people vote this issue.
Terry Moran live from that Trump event in Johnstown, Pennsylvania. Terry, thank you.